All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Eugene Hernandez. I'm the director of the New York Film Festival, and I work at Film at Lincoln Center in New York. Before I introduce our guests, let me just say a few things about today's conversation and sort of set up the conversation. You've probably read a little bit about it if you're here watching it with us. The Speed Art Museum in Louisville and FilmNorth in St. Paul, Minnesota are each satellite cinemas who are presenting films at this 2021 Sundance Film Festival, this very different Sundance Film Festival. And both organizations have had a strong commitment to social and racial justice. And they're finding strategies to support the vision of filmmakers, to reach audiences, and to inspire change to build stronger communities. This commitment has only been intensified and strengthened, understandably, by the recent events in both cities. So the Speed and FilmNorth are partnering to organize this online conversation as part of the Beyond Film programming happening at this year's 2021 Sundance Film Festival. It's an opportunity to discuss ways that producers, directors, distributors, and venues, locations, can support the ideas of filmmakers in using film to stimulate social change. So to provoke that conversation, interrogate those questions, and really dig into some of these topics in the hour that we have today, we have some exceptional participants in our conversation. So I'll invite each panelist to talk more about their work over the course of the conversation. So I won't, do a long introduction, but we have some really exceptional guests. Dory Begley is the EVP at Magnolia Pictures. Welcome, Dory.
Thank you, Eugene.
Hi. Melinda Ahrens is the SVP of Social Impact for Participant. Hi, Melinda.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. And Peter Nix directed The Force and also directed, among others, a new film that we're all really looking forward to watching called Homeroom, which is screening at the 2021 Sundance Film Festival. Peter, welcome.
Hey, Eugene. How are you? Good to see you.
Good to see you. Well, look, I'm just going to dive right in. I've written down some questions. Our friends at the Speed and FilmNorth have shared a few suggestions and questions with me as well. I want to acknowledge and thank Dean and Andrew for all of their great work in putting together and organizing this, and their institutions for supporting this conversation and this topic, and looking forward to talking with you all today. So maybe what we can do is start with, why don't we start with John Lewis Good Trouble, if we can, because I think it's a recent enough example that will help us kind of lay a foundation for some of the additional topics or aspects of the conversation that have come up in the introduction that I set up. So if you don't mind, why don't we start there? And I'm going to start with, Dory, I'm going to start with you because maybe what you could do, Magnolia distributed John Lewis Good Trouble. The film is produced by a participant. If you don't mind, Dory, give us the sort of, for people who may not know the full scope of your work, give us the sort of 20-second context for the work that you specifically do and you run at Magnolia, and then tell us about how you got involved with the film. And then Melinda, I'm going to ask you to kind of dig deeper into that, and we can kind of go back and forth on this as a sort of case study, because I think it'll bring up a lot of the topics that we want to sort of dig into over the rest of the conversation today, if you don't mind. So Dory, we'll start with you.
Yeah. I'm the executive vice president, as Eugene said, so I oversee a number of departments at Magnolia, but I came up in acquisitions, so that always tends to be my focus. And it's, I have to say, I wish Diane Wireman were here. It was such a long and winding road to make this happen. Basically, as soon as I heard CNN was working with Dawn Porter on the John Lewis documentary, I didn't know anything else about it, and I just was on them, every week, like, how can we do this? What do we do? And as is the case with most co-acquisitions with Participant and Magnolia, it's usually Diane calling me or me calling Diane saying, oh my God, did you see this? I love this. Can we work together? It's a pretty informal initial process. And luckily, we've worked with each other so often, we're in a groove. And so that subject, that director, the producers involved, it were no-brainers for us. But then it took a very long time for reasons that we could do a whole other panel on that are, rights-specific reasons.
What's a very long time? What's a very long time when you use that reference?
Oh, over a year.
Yep.
And well over a year. It may have been 2 years. I can go back in my archive. I try to block that out because it was harrowing occasionally, because we really wanted to get it done, as did I think most of the people involved with the film, including the filmmakers. But again, the windowing and rights issues can make things complicated. So we finally figured it out, came on board. They were already well into the production process. CNN, was on board. Time Studios, AGC was on board for international, and we just immediately started talking about what is the way in terms of John Lewis's career is extraordinary, obviously, and spans so much, covers so much ground. Voter rights seemed to be the through line that would pack the most kind of punch when we talk about not just impact, but also what do audiences want to see and engage with right now. And what does he care about most right now in that moment? And what is he working towards, full on in that moment? And so that we started to kind of imagine the campaign around that, and it went on from there. I'm not sure how far you want me to go into those details yet, but yeah.
Dory, I'm going to set you up as a follow-up. I'm going to set you up to tell us a little bit more about your career, your background, your recent work with the following question. What was it about, so you talked about being all over this film from, hearing about the subject, what it was, what it was going to explore, who was involved. Just give our audience a little bit of context. Tell us about some of the other films that you've worked on recently, or what it was about this film at this moment that told you that this was going to be something you obviously couldn't have predicted the world that it would come out in. But I'm looking looking for a little bit of context about why. Help us understand what your thought process was about why and how it connects to other films you've worked on, Magnolia's worked on, you've worked on with other partners as well.
Yeah, I mean, part of it that I won't bore you with goes back to, my college thesis and just who I am as a person and what I've studied and what I care about. And that is, a genuine driver of my interest. But also at Magnolia, we've had these incredible successes with RBG and I Am Not Your Negro, and also several other films that really championed seasoned heroes. And even if we're talking about Iris Apfel, which is like totally on the other end of the spectrum, there's something about reminding people, not just asking people to honor our elders, but reminding people of who they are, flesh and blood, what drives them, and what they've accomplished in a way that's super engaging. And of course, I hadn't seen the film at that point. But knowing Don Porter and the subject, that's why I was all in. We have a certain blueprint. We have this blueprint of working with participant in the impact space. We have a blueprint of how to release these films just sort of even in a vacuum. And it just made perfect sense for us and for the team. Of course, as you said, not knowing what the world would turn into exactly. Of course, knowing that everything is not as it should be.
So we're going to get back to that. I like the word blueprint you used. So let's come back to that word. Let's put it aside for a minute. Melinda, I want to bring you into this conversation before we get back to this question of a blueprint, because obviously the world had different ideas in mind, despite whatever blueprint you might have had in your head when you and your colleagues at Participant and the other partners you worked with initiated this. But maybe help us understand first, as I asked Dory, help us understand a little bit more of the work you do. Social impact is it's in the name, it's in the DNA of the organization. It's not something that a Participant does as an extension. It's built into the very notion and the foundation of the company, right? So help us understand your role there, first of all, and then help us understand better about, from your end of the story, how Participant was thinking about this film, those early conversations with the partners, including Magnolia, and kind of laying the foundation for our audience to understand sort of where this particular film kind of originated and how.
Oh, and on cue, my dog decided to bark right at that
No
moment.
problem. No problem.
Sorry about that. It was literally incredible. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Our model is really unique in that we we do build impact into sort of everything that we do in every film that we put out into the world. Essentially, the way that what we do is we sort of create what we call an impact slate, where we look at working closely with Diane, who already got a shout out, and her team. Incredible development team on both narrative and documentary. And we sort of look at, what we have coming up the same way that you would look at a distribution slate, and think about, okay, we can't put, we have limited time, limited resources. We do sort of impact work around all of our films, but we do sort of designate films that we believe are just hitting at such an incredibly timely manner that we can really leverage putting staff and resources against an impact campaign that can last, 6 months, a year. Some campaigns are still going on years and years later when it comes to leveraging the film for impact. So that's what we do. We sort of take a look at our slate and we try and figure out, what do we think if we were to really aggressively do an impact campaign around this film, what would that look like? And what's sort of the best use of everyone's time and resources. Obviously, a big factor in that is distribution. And, as Dory mentioned, being in a groove with Magnolia and Participant and having that blueprint is just huge. And having that participant for about 2.5 years and doing multiple impact campaigns with multiple different distributors, it's just incredible to just sort of go in having that shorthand and, knowing how the other team works and being sometimes doing multiple films at once together. So that's been really amazing. And I'm happy to sort of go into details about how we came up with the campaign for John Lewis, or I can take a beat, but that's essentially how we sort of show up and try and come to the table. And we look at everything that we do in the impact space as completely partner driven. One sort of set of partners is the artists, the filmmaker, in this case, Dawn, who clearly had, an incredible vision for what she wanted to do with the film and her relationship and understanding of Congressman Lewis. Another set of partner, our distributor, in this case, Magnolia, incredible partner, and extremely helpful to sort of be aligned from day one and get on the same page in terms of how we want to show up in the world with the film. And then the third set of partnerships, which is I think what we really, where we really dig in on the social impact team at Participant, is what we call our impact partners. And that's really, when you say impact campaign, it's actually incredibly wide ranging, and you have to actually be super strategic because there's so much work to be done on any one of these issues that you could really just throw a bunch of stuff at the wall. And what we've learned works best is taking a lot of time and doing a ton of research to kind of figure out who the right partners should be in the impact space, who's on the front lines doing the work that we want to leverage the film to help catalyze and further out. And then we are really, and there he goes again, sorry. Edgar, sorry guys. We're just totally partner driven where we, Edgar, thank you. Where we really, listen deeply to our partners on the ground and what they need. And there's all kinds of specific examples around that with John Lewis, Good Trouble, that I could, as Dory said, could do a whole different panel about that, but that's sort of our general model. And I think it's why this one was such a big success.
So what we can do, I think, is we'll come back to John Lewis, Good Trouble, and use some of those examples that I think both of you have been referencing. But here's what I want to do as well, and I want to bring Pete into the conversation because I want to take a sort of 30,000 foot view and take a half step back for a minute before we kind of go deeper and look at specific examples. And it could be John Lewis, it could be other films. There's this fundamental question that's at the heart of what we're trying to get to. So thank you, Dory and Melinda, for giving us that context and setting it up. In the description I shared with you a minute ago that was shared with me as this panel was being constituted, it was this notion that producers and filmmakers and distributors and art houses, venues, can collaborate to support the ideas of filmmakers in using their work to stimulate social change. So I wonder, and Pete, I'm going to start with you, but I want to give each participant, each person on the panel a chance to think about this. What do you think of that fundamental question, that fundamental statement of films stimulating social change? As a filmmaker, Pete, how do you think about that when you're thinking about films you're going to initiate, or is that something that I don't know? Tell me about how you grapple with that question, because it's fundamental to what we're trying to explore today, and then we'll dig into it from a few perspectives.
I mean, I would imagine that every story is a social issue, I guess, in my opinion. I don't approach my films directly thinking about the social issue or thinking about the impact campaign. In a way, it's like almost like you don't start your film thinking, oh, I'm gonna go make a film that'll win an Academy Award. Like, there's no guarantee anybody's gonna like care about your film. There's so much content out there now. There's so many choices. There's so many incredible films that you could spend 3 years pouring your heart into something that misses the boat, or that gets overshadowed. So I think for me, I really try to stay focused on a sort of different goal, which is trying to, for me in particular, it was about this grand narrative of Oakland that I sort of, when I started the waiting room, I knew immediately that Oakland itself, that the healthcare system and access to it was not just in a silo, it was related to other things like the criminal justice system and the education system. And so that was sort of my mission. And then along the way, I think every film has been different, and every film has, been held by the audience differently and by distributors and critics differently. So it's been an evolving thing, but I have learned along the way that the huge role that, with the waiting room, I did a Kickstarter to take it out theatrically myself. Wendy Lydell took it out independently. And that was my first entree into that, because nobody really knew who I was. Nobody knew the film got rejected by most of the festivals. I think True False accepted it. And then it kind of like got a life, but it's really, one of the things I have learned is what kind of difference like a really strong partner, a distributor, an impact producer can have on a film that could be teetering in between people paying attention and not. And so I do think that that's something that I've grown into, sort of understanding and sort of weaving a little bit more into my process, but usually toward the end. At the beginning, it's all about sort of immersing, finding the story, finding the character, because at the end, that's what drives it.
It's a great answer for me to hear that, because I failed to mention the waiting room earlier, but it was how I met you as one audience member. And when I saw that film, and I believe I did see it at True False that year, I didn't go in looking for a film. Just speaking as an audience member, I didn't go in looking looking for a film that was going to illuminate a specific issue to me, or I wasn't thinking about it from that perspective. And yet, watching the film, and it's a brilliant film, and I hope folks that are tuning into this panel will get a chance to see The Waiting Room, because the conversations, the issues that it raises, the impact that it can have it reveals itself as we get to know the people that you've decided to explore and whose lives you've decided to explore, and the people you introduce us to right in the film. And so that's to me what's really interesting for the group, is that I'm just using myself as an audience member. I might be drawn to just a subject matter, a place, a world I'm not as familiar with as I would like to be, and then that in watching it, I think a lot of audiences think that way. In watching it, it can reveal things that might motivate action or questions, curiosity, that can then have an impact, right? So that brings us back to that question of social impact. Pete, we'll come back to you. Dorian, Melinda, what do you think of this question? I mean, I guess I could reframe it to say, given the work that you've done, you believe films can stimulate social change.
For sure. I mean, I have very complicated feelings about impact work around film in general. We could get into that maybe more, but absolutely, I think it's without question that certain films can stimulate, be an impetus for real change. Sometimes it's the measuring of that change. I think that gets very, very complicated and can be troublesome when we're talking about this space. You don't want to necessarily measure films that you believe to be cause related by the direct impact that they have. That's not a good thing for this ecosystem that we all work in. But other films that have no impact campaign whatsoever have like Blackfish is an example. You know, we did that with CNN a long time ago. There was not, we had certain people working on certain things, but it was not like what we do with Participant. There was not some giant impact campaign around it. It had some of the most direct measurable impact of any of the films that we've released. And then you have something like Food Aid, where you do have this big impact campaign and it's extraordinarily measurable. But others like I'm Not Your Negro, how would you measure that impact necessarily? And would you, as a responsible distributor, try to shoehorn a specific issue and burden the film with that, which I think is a whole other issue to talk about in terms of expecting filmmakers to be involved in this impact work. So I just really muddied up that question, I guess. But it's very, you know, it's something that we try to be really responsible in the way and that's why I love working with Participant too. Participant doesn't just say, that's a cause related film, Magnolia's working on that, let's do that. Here's how we can do impact. They're very clear on, and Melinda kind of alluded to this earlier, they have finite resources. They work extraordinarily hard on these films. They might say, that'll be interesting to co-distribute with you. It doesn't really feel to us like it makes sense for a full-blown impact campaign. Or vice versa, we love the film, it doesn't fit for what we're doing. Whereas I might blindly be like, this seems like cause related. So I really appreciate that. And over the years, I think we've also, as a company, started to see that when impact producers create these kind of artificial goals shoehorned into a film that maybe doesn't match it, it's sort of a waste of everybody's time and resources when you could be using that film and just giving it to organizations on the ground who are already doing this work and let them use it as a tool for fundraising, for engagement. And that's especially something that we've learned since March. And it's been so exciting. And that's, I don't know if we want to start talking about virtual cinema now, but it's been extraordinary to work with all the organizations that we worked with in the past, plus like 200 more, and saying, you guys are doing the work, you women are doing the work, use our film, we'll make a web page for you, you encourage your members to click on it, you get half the net. Treating them like the theaters are treated in the virtual cinema space. And that's been exciting too. It's not gonna save the world, but it feels more useful than creating a artificial campaign after the credit rolls.
Complicating the conversation is meaningful for us in this context, because I think folks are tuning into this conversation hopefully to dig deeper into really understanding how to think through some of these ideas around social impact and filmmaking. Do you feel like before I go to Melinda with a follow-up, do you feel like you complicated it enough? Do you feel like you explained the complication around it well enough?
I probably could have explained it more articulately and thoroughly. But I mean, yeah, I think I read Garrett Bradley talking about this with time in a really much more interesting way than I just presented it. But the idea that the central character of that film should be the one doing the impact work, because she was already doing that impact work. So if I had been lucky enough to release Time, which I desperately wanted to do, that would have been, I hope, in retrospect, my first thing. Okay, how can we support that work at that particular organization in New Orleans, and then see how else we can work around it, instead of pushing Garrett out there to try to be the face of an impact campaign. Steve James has always, I think, said something similar about that. And so yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to keep that in mind when you're thinking about your expectations of artists in particular.
That's a really good point. Let me ask Melinda to jump in to maybe first, Melinda, if you don't mind, offer a little bit of context for us, because you're working in the world of some of these campaigns that we're talking about. Maybe you can help our audience better understand. Maybe this touches on the blueprint that Dory was talking about earlier, but help us understand what it means when someone says, we're going to do a social impact campaign with this film. Or not, or what does that even mean, and what are the components of that, and how do you work with a filmmaker who as Pete was saying earlier, sometimes maybe a filmmaker isn't thinking about, some filmmakers might be, but in this case, what if you have a filmmaker who isn't thinking about the campaign, but is open to kind of opening their film up through a campaign? So can you kind of break some of that down for us?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack, and I agree with so much of what Dory said. I think you've put it beautifully. So I think there are a couple of ways to answer that. I guess, again, I would go back to, it's funny because we're talking, we keep mentioning a blueprint, but it's one of the most incredible things is how truly bespoke and individualized every single film. The same way that a marketing campaign would be incredibly, a good marketing campaign is not just going to be one size fits all, right? You have to figure out who your audience is. You have to figure out who are going to be the best sort of spokespeople and the people that you do want out being the face of speaking about the film. And it's exactly the same with an impact campaign. So, as Dory said, it's not like, every single film is going to be right for a campaign and would be the right use of time and resources. There's so many different factors. A filmmaker's desire to see an impact campaign and desire to be involved in one is certainly a huge factor. But on the flip side, we sort of think about, there are artists who are artists/activists, the kind of Ava DuVernays of the world who this is their life's work, in addition to, Julia Reichert, who and Steve Wagner, who we did American Factory with, really are impact people. I think Dawn would definitely put herself in that camp as well. People who you certainly don't start a film, and create a story thinking, let's go win an Oscar or let's go do social impact with this. You make the best film that you can make. But there are people who have a lot of experience in the social impact and film space. And then there's sort of, the sort of opposite spectrum of that, people who might say, this is what you guys do. You're really good at it. Go forth, do whatever you want to do. I'm sort of going to be over here on my next project, and whatever happens is gravy. And that's fine too. I mean, there's plenty of ways to do great impact campaigns where you don't have the filmmaker, in the weeds on everything. It doesn't mean that impact can't be successful, as long as you're not going against their wishes, right? Or doing something they don't want you to do. But then I think there's a really interesting space in between, which is I think where most, I can't speak for filmmakers, but, again, from my experience, is where most filmmakers lie, which is if they end up doing their film with participant, and we do believe that we can actually move the needle on an issue leveraging that film, it's really exciting and amazing to see that sort of that world open up for them, and it's sort of the same thing. It's the reverse of seeing some of our impact partners suddenly understand, we don't just go out to what we call our impact partners in this case, John Lewis Good Trouble, it was Black Voters Matter and NAACP of Georgia. We had a big focus on Georgia, and, for obvious reasons, given Lewis's history there. And now what we see, kind of thrillingly as the kind of, massive political change that's happened there. But it's not like you go to a group like Black Voters Matter and they're like, oh, a film impact campaign. I know exactly how to use this movie to catalyze my work. I mean, there's a lot of sort of, training's the wrong word, but there's a lot of partnership work that goes in on both sides. And so a perfect example of that from the artist side, and I can take zero credit for the Roma campaign because I like to joke that I joined participant the year that we had Roma, RBG, and Green Book, and that all the Oscars were, clearly because I had joined that year. But, I take no credit for Roma because I kind of came in midstream, but, the team has done and continues to do incredible work there. And it points up a lot of what the questions that you and Dory raised, which is, it's not like Alfonso Cuarón made Roma because he wanted to help domestic workers. He made Roma because it was, again, I'm not speaking for Alfonso Cuarón and never would presume to, but, he has spoken about this many times, that it was his childhood and his, Cleo was inspired by his own childhood experience. But then because the film was at participant, conversations began about, well, could you do an impact campaign around a film like Roma, which is not exactly like, like prime impact campaign material, given how artistic it is, given its narrative film, foreign language, black and white, on a streamer. It basically had a lot of things going against it from an impact campaign perspective. But once we started to explore what those on the ground partners would look like, CASA is a group that Alfonso had worked with in Mexico, and then IGENPU and the National Domestic Workers Alliance here in the United States. And it was just this perfect merging of the NDWA dying to do real narrative change work around what does it mean to be a domestic worker? How can you elevate a domestic worker's story? And then this film like landed, and it was just this perfect synergy. And that work continues to be ongoing. I'm extremely excited. I wish I had some fabulous announcement about the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, but we helped introduce that part of the impact campaign. Yeah. Part of the impact campaign was doing a screening on Capitol Hill with then Senator Kamala Harris and Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, who introduced the first ever Domestic Workers Bill of Rights on the Hill. And we this was, I guess, 2 years ago at this point. So it was sort of like, well, if we ever got a Democratic Senate, and, it's crazy, look where we are. So I doubt that it's number 1 on the agenda, but I can guarantee you that, we will be doing everything we can to sort of leverage Roma alongside the NDWA to sort of knock down those doors. And then in Mexico, what happened was because of the relationship with CASA, this is, basically the equivalent of a group working for domestic workers' rights for 30 years in Mexico. And what you had was this simultaneous thing happen, that sort of perfect alchemy where, Yalitza became this, you had the first indigenous woman ever, on the cover of Vogue and starring in this film. You had Alfonso, who's a household name in Mexico. So you had a huge cultural shift that you can't plan for. I mean, those are the parts of social impact that I would kill to say, hey, we're going to do narrative change around indigenous Mexican women within Mexico and colorism within Mexico. You can't plan for that. That was just magic. But what you can prepare for, as Dory said, and where the impact campaign can come in, is to say to a group like CASA, let us help you catalyze. You're doing the work. You've been doing it for 30 years. You don't need us to keep that moving. But can we say, let's do a screening with, the Mexican government and try and really have a conversation around these issues? And sure enough, they passed the first ever federal domestic workers' rights in Mexico. And, people call it the Roma effect. And so I think that's a very good example of, and it's not, again, Alfonso Cuarón did not make Roma a social impact film, but it ended up having enormous social impact from sort of in people's headspace and their way of thinking about the domestic workers in their own lives and what they mean to their own families. And then you actually ended up seeing really serious policy change as a result of an impact campaign. So that's a great example. And we could, again, we started this conversation around John Lewis, and I think there's really good examples in there too. But that sort of, I hope that answers some of those questions, because, every campaign is very different and very unusual. But when you have that combination of filmmaker, just hopefully distributor, producer, stars, and impact organizations aligned, it's pretty special. And I do think it's something that only film can achieve. We're not the right intervention for everything by far. We're not the right intervention for most things, but on certain things, it is such a special and unique intervention that can really only be done through opening up people's kind of hearts and minds through the medium that is film.
It's a great answer. Thank you. Let me go back to Pete. And Pete, I have, we're going to come back to some of the specific examples again, but I have a 2-part question, and the first part might be tougher. The second part might be hopefully easier, but it builds on what you were talking about earlier. And that is listening to what we're talking about here in relation to impact campaigns and engagement. Does this conversation, what might it illuminate for you, but also what might it complicate for you, building on what you were saying earlier about how you think about developing, pursuing a film. So that's part 1. And part 2 is, if you don't mind, since we're having this conversation in the context of the Sundance Film Festival this year, if you don't mind just telling us a little bit about your new film, Homeroom.
I would say nothing complicates. I mean, everything is learning for me, like all the ways of thinking about, how, you can join partners to come around your work. Because a lot of what we do is in isolation, not quite like a novelist, but maybe the idea starts in isolation. And then slowly you start building teams around it, and then you make the film. And so I think for me, I'm definitely not an activist filmmaker. If anyone, like, I would want to fashion myself after, it would be like someone like Cuarón, like, an artiste, or, I've always, my identity has always been a little bit more in that space, but obviously with nonfiction, there's so many ways, and both with fiction, there's so many ways to sort of create impact. And I do think of, the metrics or whatever, to me, are less important actually than the cultural impact. And you think about sort of like, novelists like Toni Morrison, try measuring the impact of her work, so with metrics, so, but I do think that all of these, connections and points and partnerships are, a lot of filmmakers don't have that, um, background, or it's not part of their identity. And I think those are very valuable, because you can push, films can do more, with better partners. So for me, that's illuminating, and always welcome. In fact, I'm thinking right now, my next film, like, I've got, there's some impact ideas that I'm thinking of right now because of this. So, in terms of my film that's at Sundance, it's the third in the trilogy. It began, as a very more of a personal project. I wanted to make a film about young people, kind of like Breakfast Club for kids of color, and my kids are mixed race kids, and a lot of it came from struggles that we were having with my daughter, who's a young mixed race girl, who was to graduate in the class of 2020. And we lost her last year. She struggled from bipolar and depression for many years. And, at one point we were going to cancel the film, but we decided to sort of push on. And a lot of my motivation was around trying to articulate the challenges that kids were facing, mental health challenges, and sort of the adolescent mental health system, and what is it like to be a kid growing up today. So this is before anything happened, like coronavirus, uprising, all that. But it was in the context of everything that I'd been doing for years, which began with a film in a public hospital waiting room. And one of the first people I met was a young girl. She was, I think, 12, and she had been shot outside her school, her middle school, Edna Brewer, right down the street from Highland. And she wasn't in school getting an education. She was in the waiting room, stuck in the waiting room, getting treatment for a bullet wound. And so that's what got me thinking about, the connections and agency of these young people and communities like Oakland, whose story had kind of been often flattened out into a two-dimensional narrative. And from my perspective, as someone with resources over the years, sort of trying to raise my kids, in particular my daughter, and really struggling with getting her help on the mental health side, and realizing that there were so many kids, living with sort of undiagnosed, untreated mental health issues. In fact, our prisons are filled with many of them. And so tangentially, those issues are sort of floating there: mental health, prison, schools to prison pipeline, just the education system itself. And so that's where we began. Really, and then when we lost our daughter, it became, for me, wanting to just sort of honor her through the stories of these kids. And Oakland High is like right down the street from Highland Hospital, where we shot the waiting room. My wife works at Highland. These were kids like my daughter, and I just sort of wanted to immerse in their world and tell their story. And then, of course, then it was 2020. So over the course of the year, things started shifting and changing, and the film began shifting more away from mental health, and actually it sort of inverted at one point where I was interested in exploring where these kids were struggling, and instead landed with realizing their strengths and sort of, realizing how they were evolving and coming of age in this remarkable moment in time in which they lost so much, in terms of their dreams of going to prom and graduating and all those things. And so that is basically, what the film became, was trying to, capture this moment in time, bringing itself out from a personal loss, for myself as an artist and a dad, into this broader loss that we're all facing as a world, but in particular this class of 2020. And so, really in powerful ways, sort of tied itself back into, why I make movies. I think why they resonate with people, that, our stories, the best impact campaigns can happen when there's a universality, where there's a recognition that, that this is connected to me in some way, or that I can make a difference. And so that's something that, I think we're all very excited in terms of this film, what this film can do in showing. It's probably the most hopeful film that I've made, actually, of the trilogy, in ways that, I think will, be clear, when you see these amazing kids and the story that we were able to capture.
Well, again, I look forward to seeing your work in this case, and continuing to interrogate your work. Pete, so thank you for sharing that context with us. Let me take a step back. And as we're recording this, it's a day after the inauguration, as we're recording this conversation. And the question I have as we dig into our last 15 minutes of this conversation, the question I have is really about, it actually builds on some of what Pete was just saying. In the inauguration, we heard from President Biden and Vice President Harris, and we saw in some of the work that was done on the first day, and folks will watch this further on into the administration. But we heard very plainly and clearly a number of issues that were kind of presented in many different ways throughout the course of this one day. Issues around the pandemic, issues around the economy, issues around racial equity, climate change, immigration, so many others, and a call to examine and to really interrogate some of these issues, and to try to, figure out how to tackle many of these, or put them back on a front burner, in an agenda. And I wonder, for all of you, how you think about, not if you think about, because we've sort of covered that already, but how you think about the role, your own role in that work. We have leaders around us who have been and who are putting forward a list of questions and subjects that can't just be resolved with, the signing of a document or the passing of a law. They're going to be it's going to be challenging. So how are you thinking about sort of this specific moment we're in? It's 2021, it's the beginning of this year, and there's so much happening. How are you thinking about how you intersect the work you do, the films you work on, the campaigns you create around that work, or the choices you make, and connecting that to these bigger questions? Anybody can take that.
I mean, I as usual, feel very complicated about that thought in general. I mean, I think, personally, and also in so many of the films that we've worked on, this idea that, like, don't look away, you've got to look deeper. Like, the adults in the room, especially in our various administrations for as long as I've been alive, have been like, okay, yeah, that's a problem, but this is the priority. And especially at a time of emergency, it is very easy for those in power to say, we're going to get to that, but this is the priority. And I think and hope that the work that we do, and also the work that this new administration is embarking on, will walk and chew gum at the same time and understand that if we don't examine this essential ill of this country, of slavery and genocide, it sounds like this lofty academic activist whatever, but it is this seething disease that will stay at our core if we don't dive in and every day, not once a year, not every February, not when something horrible happens, but literally imbibe it in all of the policy decisions and all of the decisions that we make as individuals, and what we're going to consume and what we're going to support. So I try, I hope that there'll be more films that will speak to that in different ways, and we'll certainly push them out there. And I hope that all the work that we do around these films grapples with that in a way that's pretty uncomfortable, because I think it's the only way for real progress.
I think that the state of things right now, to me, is the strongest argument that we've ever had for these films that can take us into spaces. And I think also filmmakers need to be courageous about stepping into spaces that they're uncomfortable with. Maybe I think about like Roberto Maravini made a trilogy set in Texas, the last of which was called The Other Side, which I think is 5 years ago, which like it's remarkable if you go back and watch that. It basically it basically like showed you this fuse being lit. I do think it goes all the way back to probably, like you said, slavery, but that understanding that context of how we got here. We didn't just get here from militia groups starting to get agitated 5 years ago, which Roberto captured so amazingly, but he stepped into that space in a way that was basically non-judgmental, where he said, I'm not going to like judge these people. I'm just going to go in and tell their story. And that has a powerful effect. And so I think there's a lot of different ways that actually we can get an impact that sometimes are on the nose and sort of activisty, but also in other ways that, require us to step into other people's, spaces. And I think that's going to be much more important over the next, this sort of transition between, the metastasization of this discontent or anger or fear that just happened, and what's going to happen over the next 4 years, and what role do people like AOC play, what the Bidens of the world, all the Trump people, Kamala, like who are her constituents, who does she speak for? So storytelling is going to play a very, very strong role, I think, in this next phase, and really defining the values of the American identity. And so I think that's going to be an important it's definitely energizing, I think, for myself as a storyteller, and the fact that we've got so many different platforms now and partners and people to help tell stories around the stories is encouraging to me.
Look, it's a great question. My whole background is, I started my career at ABC News and was a political producer there for 12 years, and then worked on the Hillary campaign and then a participant. So like I'm very intertwined with, politics and oh well, I guess I just lost my lighting here. And so I think about this question constantly, and I thought about it a lot in the lead up to the election, which was, another reason why John Lewis' Good Trouble was such a great film for us to be involved in. I think the biggest thing is the opportunity that this summer opened up to reckon with our history and to do some serious mind-opening work, if you will. I agree. I don't think it's so much on the nose. As Pete just said, there are some films that are very on the nose, and maybe something about climate change or something like that can be very sort of specific. But we have a film coming out, it's premiering at Sundance, Judas and the Black Messiah, which we're incredibly excited to be a part of, about Fred Hampton and the Black Panthers. And, we grappled with this. I don't want to get into too many details about something that hasn't come out yet, but, we're in the process right now of building that campaign. And we have been grappling with, it's clearly incredibly relevant to this moment. There's a whole line of work that you could do around freeing Panthers, Black Panthers that are still incarcerated. There's all different ways that you could go that are a little bit more on the nose, but I think where we've landed is that there's just a huge swath of people in this country, myself included, before doing a lot of research into it, who don't know. I knew who Fred Hampton was. I didn't know much about anything beyond the circumstances of his death. I knew very little about who the Panthers were and the kind of community work that they were doing. There's just whole swaths of racial history that we either haven't been taught or we've been taught propaganda, the wrong thing, that we have to sort of unlearn. And I do think, there's a whole thing about with what happened this summer with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, and how many people were buying books on anti-racism. And I've gotten into this conversation a few times where, on the one hand, it's true that, great, well, Black people die and white people buy books. On the flip side, it is a huge cultural shift that people are making how to be anti-racist in books like that. I believe that's a very positive indicator, even just the interest in actually taking a look at what goes on in this country and what has always gone on in this country. And it did feel like an opening this summer. And I think our role is, as Dory said, don't look away. Don't feel like, well, we got Trump out, we're good. We're not good. Those forces are very much still there. They were there 2 weeks ago, and they're not going anywhere. And they will continue to pollute and infect our culture and our society until we do a lot of work on ourselves. And I think that, you take a movie like Judas, if somebody were to say to me, you should really you really should read this book about the Black Panthers, I'm probably not going to do it, if I'm being honest. If you say to me, you should really watch this Oscar contender with these unbelievable performances and this incredible script and this just really interesting perspective on that moment in history, I'm going to watch that movie. And then I'm going to think to myself, God, this movie seems relevant for something that takes place almost 50 years ago. I wonder why that is. And that when we get into that immeasurable type of impact work, that's what I'm talking about. It's going to be hard for us to measure. Did we open people's minds and connect Fred Hampton and the Panthers to today's movement? And the fact that we call, 5 years ago, we were calling Black Lives Matter radical and revolutionary, and you should be afraid of those people. So I don't know if we're going to be able to measure that. We're definitely going to try, but the point is that is the type of work that I think we can continue doing. I just want to say one last thing, which is, Dory and I worked really closely together, our companies, on something we call private screening experiences for corporate audiences, which is something that the John Lewis film was so, talk about things you couldn't time. You could never have predicted what happened this summer, the release of this movie and the scale that doing things virtually allowed us to imagine. And we reached, 100,000 more people that way through these screenings. And we've been thinking about, Judas and the Black Messiah. And I think a year ago, we wouldn't have been able to say, hey, corporate audience, are you interested in seeing this? I think now we're already getting inbound from corporate audiences about that. That is a cultural shift that is pretty remarkable. We want to screen a movie about the Black Panthers and the murder by the FBI of one of our own citizens without due process for, a bank. Like, we have to lean into that. And that is the type of work that I think film can do, because it gives people a way to have a conversation that they normally just would never, ever have and wouldn't think to have in that space. And then to Pete's point, it gives other audiences proximity, individualized audience, a proximity to an issue or an uncomfortable space that they might not normally walk into. So I think that was a very generic, long-winded way of saying it, but I think people have a tendency now to say, well, we're okay. And I think that film gives an opportunity, storytelling gives an opportunity to not scold, but just open up a door and a window into people's minds that I think is almost more important now than it even was during the Trump era.
Can I say one thing on that? You can cut it out if you want. But first of all, I'm a giant Shaka King fan, gigantic. And it's just, this example is also, it's such an interesting one when we talk about prioritizing the art and what real impact can, because the film, and I haven't seen the finished film, but what I know of it and what I know of him, it is about all those things, but it's also a meditation on betrayal, and it's also the vision of an auteur. And I think those are the films that pack the biggest punch when we're talking about bringing an audience along for a visceral experience, that then they take something away. Maybe they jump out of their seat and they want to sign up. Maybe they go home and think long and hard about something that they hadn't really recognized before. And so I'm super excited to see the finished film. And I think the impact worked around it is going to be so complex and interesting because of that.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of, obviously we too are massive Shaka King fans, and it's been a total honor to even, get to start working with him. So it's very exciting to go into the campaign, but that's a perfect example of sort of, putting the film and the artist's vision first. It is not a type of on the nose thing. And we actually went back and forth about, can we ask people just to, it's not the kind of experience that you finish and are like, great, I'm activated, I'm ready to go, I'm now going to go, sign this petition. Roma was exactly the same. It felt so disjointed to watch that film and then say, now take action. Like, that is not the right cadence. So then it's figuring out what's the bridge, right? What can you do in that moment that honors the art and the beautiful way the story was told as a film, and then leads you ultimately to learn more and to potentially take an action after that. But it is definitely not the same as one of the more on the nose, obvious choices.
One of the few films I've watched at this year's festival, or had the opportunity to watch yet, is Judas and Black Messiah. It's an exceptional movie. It's one of those rare movies that I finished and then I went back and watched it again in the same evening. It's that good, and it's that meaningful, and the fact that it connects with, and people will learn this as they get to know it, and the fact that it actually has a link to a documentary. It has a link to Eyes on the Prize, which was a seminal document, seminal piece of art that affected just me as an audience member, as a student at the time, when it came out in the 80s or earlier. It was meaningful to me, I guess, as I'm saying. So the fact that it builds on that and goes back to that in many ways is impactful. And also want to, just as a plug, mention that one of our host entities for this conversation is the Speed Art Museum in Louisville, Kentucky. And I know that at the very least, and it's playing at a bunch of theaters, Judas, but it's playing as part of the Sundance Film Festival in connection with that institution. So if you're watching this conversation via the Speed Art Museum, really prioritize, if you can, that film. As we wrap up, I thought what might be valuable is, again, this conversation was curated by two institutions that are really thinking about strategies to engage audiences in communities in Louisville and in St. Paul, Minnesota. So there are certainly folks listening into this conversation today that may be looking for addition. You've all been great about not just mentioning films that you work on, but films that illuminate some of the topics we're talking about today. And everyone should go see Pete's work, of course, and all the films that Dory and Melinda have mentioned. But I want to give each of you a chance just to, for those looking for additional on-the-ground guidance, we're in this virtual moment where there's so much available to us, and if we can make the time when we're at home to engage with work, we can dig deep and reconnect or connect with work for the first time. So in the last few minutes we have, if each of you just want to maybe feel free to throw out additional films that might illuminate some of the topics that we're exploring, and also that might be relevant to the communities that we're hosted by in this conversation. I think it could be useful.
I guess I'll go first. I would say two things. One is a group of films that O Cinema actually partnered with us on over the summer. and a few institutions have done the same, and they're perennials, and they've kind of worked in an interesting way as a package that on first blush seems opportunistic, but actually when you think about it, each one of them interrogates all of the issues that we were just talking about. And it was I'm Not Your Negro, Who Streets, and Toni Morrison, The Pieces I Am. And this kind of essential ill manifests in different ways and is addressed in different ways in all those films, and is rich for conversation. And I think a lot of organizations are trying to figure out how to re-engage their followers, their patrons, especially with shutdowns. And we're always happy to provide those films and help with virtual conversations. It doesn't always have to involve the director or anything like that. And we've seen that, be really empowering for, local organizations on the ground who just want to, re-engage with a small community or something on a larger scale, like what Ocean Knight Foundation did across 8 cities. And then we also have in theaters now, also with Participant Collective, which is an extraordinary, I'm not even gonna say anything, because if you look it up, you'll read every single critic in the universe extolling its virtues. But if you really want to follow professionals on the ground doing their job extraordinarily well, in this case, journalists uncovering corruption, it's mind-blowing. And it really reminds you why it is incredibly important to not only to protect, but support journalists in this country and around the world. So that's my little plug.
I'm happy to go. Before plugging other Collective, which I'll just do it. Collective is beyond incredible and an absolute must-see. And it's another one of those, my boss, who's our chief impact officer, Holly Gordon, always says, artists see around corners. And there's just so many unpredictable things. We constantly find ourselves, Pete, this obviously applies to you and your films, but we're just constantly a participant, like, can't believe they made this movie 3 years ago. Like, how is this coming out right now? Judas is a perfect example. It's just incredible. So Collective coming, almost a year into the pandemic, which had nothing to do with the pandemic, but it has to do with corruption and healthcare and, it's government cover up, and it's just so phenomenal. I can't recommend it enough. I was going to say, to go back to John Lewis Good Trouble. So first of all, we absolutely love the Speed Museum so much. And I haven't worked with the folks in St. Paul, but I look forward to doing that one day. But we've done a bunch of events with Speed. And what I was going to say about John Lewis Good Trouble, big plug, go to makegoodtrouble.com, even though we are through the election and all of that energy has now come to fruition. Voter suppression will never go away as long as, if anything, it's going to, what we saw in Georgia, it's like the voter suppression people woke a sleeping giant in Georgia, and those groups advocated and worked on the ground for 10 years. And now that sleeping giant is woken on that side, it's just going to come raging back on the other side. And I think what we've learned is just how fragile our democracy is. The Voting Rights Act was gutted in 2013. I hope that this new John Lewis Voting Rights Act will pass now that we have both, Democrats have both houses, but who knows? So bottom line is, the groups on the ground that did that work are going to need, you're going to see a huge drain of resources now that everything flowed in. It's all going to flow out again. So watch John Lewis, get connected to the voting rights groups on the ground that made Georgia happen, that will continue to need support and volunteers and people just to be talking about voting rights and advocacy. And you can do all of that on makegoodtrouble.com, which is the house of the Participant Impact Campaign, which will connect people to voting rights groups. And I really think that, we're going to see a big backlash in 2 years with the midterms. So we got to keep up that momentum. Yeah, I would say, so to go back to John Lewis Good Trouble and rewatch that if you haven't already watched it. And then I would say, Collective is my kind of number one rec for new stuff coming out.
Can I add one more? I'm so sorry, Pete. I'm just sitting here thinking of like what is so important right now, and it's insane that I didn't think of this. The Fight, the ACLU documentary, is so extraordinary. I worship these filmmakers. They're so
Eli.
smart. They make, I mean, Eli, forget it. But Eli and Elise and Josh, they just have this magic touch of taking material that one might think won't be terribly engaging and turning it into like a Hollywood blockbuster. You are on a thrill ride with these ACLU attorneys. And I'm watching some of the inauguration coverage, and I think Chris Hayes in particular actually showed a clip from the fight. You know, these are the heroes that came out of the airport that day, and people saw like, oh, right, there are people out there protecting our rights, and we need to support them. And you know, the ACLU is not want for support, but watching it is also incredibly inspiring, just to act in your own way, in your own capacity. And so and you'll cry, because I cried throughout half the movie, but it does feel incredibly good in the end and inspiring. So sorry I had to add that.
No worries. Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Dory. Pete, you're going to have the final word, and I'm glad you mentioned intervening in his work. I'll endorse that, and we've had the films have really resonated with our audience at Lincoln Center when we've had the opportunity to show them in multiple contexts. But so feel free to share a few more suggestions.
I've been finishing my film, so I haven't seen a ton of stuff. I've heard about Collective. I want to see that. I guess I'll talk about two films I think are distinct for different reasons. One, I think something to underline, like, for this whole conversation is the artist. Really, at the end of the day, artists with a vision, artists with a singular voice, make impact. I mean, ultimately, and I think those are the types of films that tend to be dreams for distributors and impact producers, and because those films resonate with such a authentic and personal voice. And for me, the film this year that did that, it was Time. And I just found myself sort of wrapped up into that movie. Obviously, there's an issue there that you could sort of latch onto, but I think the direct Garrett's voice in that film is a voice that you can imagine will reappear, you know, again with another, and that we need filmmakers who have sort of, it's almost like a confidence or self-confidence with certain approaches in film that they can be challenging for audiences or distributors. So I found that film one that hits on a few different levels in terms of its artistry, in terms of its relevance, in terms of its potential for impact, its beauty, you know. Another film that I'm really, just makes me feel good because Jim Lebrecht has sound mixed all of my movies, is Crip Camp. And I think a film like that, you know, I guess you could say, oh, that's one that's on the nose. It's right. But it's because of Jim, and we go back to, you talk about people like Ava DuVernay, or you know those filmmakers who are very much Dawn. Jim is like on another level. You know, he's been living this issue. He's such a beautiful human being that sort of emanates, and that sort of spirit, because ultimately we want, you know, the spirit of hope to drive all of our work, and so much of the work that we do goes into dark places. And so I think this is like one of those films that you know, is just coming along at a time when it's not, you know, about Trump necessarily, but it is, you know, because I think back on the time that sort of Trump made fun of the reporter, and this sort of notion of how we see each other, and these films allow us to sort of reframe each other and see ourselves differently, in the world around us differently, and that's the most important thing at a time where we're just having such a hard time seeing each other. And so Crip Camp, I think, is one of those films that's just bubbling with just Jim's love, you know, for his community, but also just a reminder for us to just stop and remember that, you know, these stories have long arcs. You know, the journey of the disability community to sort of fight for their rights has been going on for sort of quite some time, and it has so many dimensions that I never even knew about. Right. So I think that's another great one. I think that people need to see this year.
Pete, you said it so well. Thank you for the final word on this conversation. For folks who have been tuning in, thank you for engaging with us, and I hope you'll dig into every single film that was mentioned here today during this conversation and more. And thank you to the Speed Art Museum in Louisville. Thank you to FilmNorth in St. Paul. Thank you to the Sundance Film Festival. And Dory, Melinda, and Pete, thank you for taking time today to talk.
Thank
Much
you,
appreciated.
Eugene.
Thank you so
As
much.
usual.